Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Power Sharing webinar. In this webinar, we will discuss ways to navigate power sharing between cultures, how to use leadership power to advocate for BIPOC staff, the importance of practicing vulnerability and ways to demonstrate it. This webinar will be about an hour and a half long with Q&A at the end. The webinar will be recorded and posted on our Facebook and YouTube channel. This webinar is hosted by the Christian Reformed Church Office of Race Relations, and this year we are celebrating 50 years in the Christian Reformed Church. So 50 years, Race Relations have resourced Christian Reformed Church members and congregations as they dismantle the cause and effects of racism within the body of believers and throughout the world. My name is Idella Winfield, and I am the Church and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Office of Race Relations. Our office focuses on 3 areas: learning to share the narrative by sharing stories of joy and pain, championing anti-racism leadership by developing leaders and building relationships, valuing unity and diversity by educating at every level. And now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Kendra David. Hey, Kendra.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me and inviting me to be the moderator today. I'm excited. My name is Kendra David. I work with the Office of Social Justice. So we are a partner / sister office of the Office of Race Relations. So there's, of course, some overlap of topics. So Office of Social Justice focuses on issues like immigration justice and climate justice. So I'm going to hand it back over to the panelists today so they can give a brief bio on themselves, and we'll start with Vivi.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Viviana Cornejo, but everybody calls me Vivi, which I like it more. In my country of origin is Chile. I moved to the United States in 1995 and started working with the CRC almost right away in the 97. And slowly I become involved in race relations, and now it's my passion. My title, I always have to look at my little thing in here because I always forget the title, but it's a racial curriculum and instruction specialist, which basically is I do the research and write manuals for workshops and prepare facilitators to do our material. And I'm excited to be here along with my co-workers and friends. So thank you, Kendra.
And before we move on to Rudy and Mark, Idella, did you have anything that you wanted to add about your background?
I did mention a little bit earlier who I was. Again, I've been in the denomination for about 14 years and started off with World Renew and Resonate for a brief time and landed here in Office of Race Relations. So that's me.
Thanks. And Rudy, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Rudy Gonzalez, and I grew up in South Texas. So for a while, when I first came into the denomination, they used to ask me what country I immigrated from. So I finally had to say I immigrated from the great country of Texas. And that kind of changed the conversation a little bit. I've been with the CRC for over 25 years, I would say. I first started working for what is now World Renew. At that time, it was the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee, and did a lot of work with churches, working with their communities. And then about 12 years ago, I joined the Office of Race Relations and working kind of on the same things, but more on racial equity in terms of economics and things like that. Been married about 45 years and have 4 kids and 8 grandkids.
And Mark, go ahead.
Sure, Mark Stephenson. I grew up in Holland, Michigan. Grew up in a CRC family, CRC churches, and went off to Calvin College, which is a Christian Reformed college. Began to feel like I knew that there were other people out there besides white CRC folks, but really hardly met any. So I volunteered for what was then called CRC Home Missions. and they sent me to San Francisco to work at the Friendship House for the American Indian. That's what it was called. And it was a wonderful opportunity to meet a lot of people who were very different from me, people who are committed Christians, some of whom were committed Christians, not all. But lots of folks different from me. Went back to Calvin College and eventually went to Calvin Seminary. And it's been just over 32 years that I've been ordained pastor in the Christian Reformed denomination. I served a couple of churches for 17 years. And then for the last 15 and a half, have been serving the CRC as Director of Disability Concerns. I'm retiring from that role at the end of this month. About a year and a half ago, well, pushing 2 years ago, I became interim director of the Offices of Race Relations and Social Justice. And of course, that's what brings us to this conversation today, is about my being working as the leader, as the director of the Office of Race Relations. So looking forward to this conversation together. My wife and I are married. We have 5 living children, one of whom is an adoption of the heart of a man of Vietnamese descent who was born here in the United States. And we have 3 grandchildren.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to move to beginning the content part of this webinar. So the first question is, and we're going to take turns with all the panelists, if you could share a little bit about your own experiences with race and power dynamics within the CRC denomination. And we'll start with Vivi if you're ready to go, Vivi.
She's on mute too.
You're muted, Vivi.
Always forget that. When I started in 95, I remember one of the things that it was for me interesting. Well, first of all, I couldn't understand what was going on because I was coming from another country, different culture, different way of acting and doing things. But after a year or two, I realized the differences. But it was frustrating for me, the fact that I was able to mention some of the things that I saw, the difference between whites and people of color and doing things and quality and things like that. But I felt that every time I was mentioning something, I never get a straight response. And that kind of frustrated me a little bit. I don't know if that answered a little bit your question, but there's a lot of examples that I can mention. I would say while I was working in home missions before, now it's called Resonate because they are merged together with world missions. I call that period of time the learning time about the Christian Reformed Church and also all the issues of racism that you can see in the church. And not that there exists a perfect church, because there's no perfect church. That's why we are there, right? Because we are sinners. But the amount of things that I was able to see, I was impressed. But as I said, it bothered me more, the fact that I mentioned things and nobody cared because I was always, in the beginning, I was always this woman that came from a different country. So what do you know?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Viviana. And that kind of answered my second part of the question of some examples, unless you wanted to share additional examples.
Yeah, I can do some. One of the things, people are able to talk about that now, but before in the past, they were not able. They were even a little bit upset when we saw those things. It's the quality of doing events, for instance. There was a big difference between the events done by white people and compared with events done by people of color. There was always low quality, which I found it a little bit upsetting, because why is that difference when we are all in the same place working with the same goal, and difference in funding and that type of things. Yeah.
Yeah, and financial support says a lot about the thought process. Yeah, thanks for that example, Vivi. Idella, I had seen you unmuted. Did you want to go next, or did you want to pass on this one?
Yeah, I think for me, when I first started working in the denomination, I knew it was different, right? I knew something was different. A few things were different, right? For me, it was just, okay, I needed to learn and understand the history of this denomination in order to be able to maneuver, right? To communicate and be part of the denomination. So it was very different from my background. Yeah, so I think for me is I just needed to learn a little bit more about, the history, the dynamics, the culture. That was a big piece, the culture. In order for me to be able to maneuver and be part of this denomination, I had to understand the culture in a way that communicate with my colleagues, how things are done, what's the importance or values or certain things that I needed to know. So yeah, I think for me, it's just, I knew a lot was different. It was not part of my background. Even growing up in Grand Rapids, I always wondered, like, what this building was on 20th Street in Kalamazoo. What was that building? What was it about? What was there? I never knew. I mean, I've seen a lot of these CRC churches in Grand Rapids, but I never really knew a lot about, the church itself or the culture. So I think for me, being part of this denomination, it was important. It was very important for me to learn the history and understand a little bit about the culture in order for me to survive, right? Because I'm coming into it not knowing anything about the denomination or culture. So I think for me as an African-American woman being part of this denomination, I think it was important for me to really learn how to, in a sense, to be part of the denomination. How do I relate, right? How do I be in relationship with other people that's, this is their denomination. So I think relationship wise, it was very important for me to learn that, and never just to survive. Those were pieces that I needed to know. Yeah, so I think, yeah, just the history and the culture. And it's been very helpful.
Did you have any other additional examples you wanted to share? Or were your examples kind of wrapped up in your answer?
Yeah, I think Vivi talked a little bit about it earlier, about events, right? I think those were huge pieces of way that you've seen events being done, right? And who made the decisions and why they made decisions and what values they put on the decisions. I think that was very clear to me how things you need to know that in order to be part of this. And, we put on events, from race relations too, but we do it in a different way. Not that it's a good or bad. I think it's just a different way because we're coming into it in a way that we're bringing our cultures, right? Our culture into the way we do things. So yeah, I think, that's my example.
Thanks, Idella. Rudy, I'm going to restate the question since it's been a while since I asked the question, so you can fully process what you want to say. So the question is, if you could share a little bit about your own experiences with race and power dynamics within the CRC denomination.
So I have several examples, and I guess as I share some of these, I'm thinking that the purpose in us sharing is to bring about healing. It does not mean that there won't be some conflict or maybe some differences of how people see it. In fact, I think that's what happens, that we come in with a certain lens and other folks are coming in with another lens. And I think as those differences kind of root in and we dig into how we see things, that then there's conflict. So I'll just share that when I came to the denomination, I had been working I've been working at at Rockwell, which is an aerospace company, as a project manager. And I was trusted with millions of dollars in terms of projects. But when I came into the denomination, I was questioned to the penny on a lot of things. So that felt, I was looking at it from a lens of, here I am, a Latino, I'm coming into this group, and there's big differences. Are those differences just cultural differences, or is there some stigma attached to the way people are viewing me, that somehow there's a trust issue at hand? So that was one of the first examples that I came into the denomination. I don't think it was anybody being mean or anything like that. It was just that there was that at least in my mind, there was some socialized views of who I was. The other thing was, the other example I remember was being in a meeting, and that was about the time that I think it's called United Reformed Church split away from the Christian Reformed Church. And there was a leader in a meeting who stopped the meeting because there was a woman in the room. And then that was totally rude on from my point of view, that they would actually do something like that, and felt like something is off with this. It just didn't feel right. So that was a little bit of maybe more on the gender, but it was also an Asian lady. So it felt like that. A third one was on the funding of how we funded church planters. And I remember a friend of mine, Min Lee, was funded at a much lower level than other folks who were white. And when they finally, he asked what was the deal, and then it was because he didn't attend Calvin Seminary. So after that, he attended Calvin Seminary, and he still didn't get the funding. And it was because he was in a community that most likely would not be able to support the funding level that the denomination could fund. So those are just a few examples.
Thanks, Rudy. And before we move on to Mark, we did have a question from the audience about, and the question is from someone who plans events, and they'd like to know if the incidents that Idella and Vivi were referring to were kind of about white folks being a little bit stingy with refreshments and the logistics of events.
Well, refreshment was a detail. No, it was the quality in the place where you're hosting the event, whatever it is, let's say a church planters event or an assessment center that it was used to do in the past. The place itself was not of good quality. The amount of days taking the time to do this work was always short. The capacity of assess the people who were doing or evaluating this, it wasn't very professional. So the way I felt in that moment in the past, it was like, why is it that they are not paying attention to this detail which are actually important, because these people are also going to be church planters. They're going to be going out in not building churches, but at least beginning to have people. So they will need the same preparation, the same capacity as anybody else. But then I also thought, well, maybe because they were in these high risk neighborhoods planting churches, meaning people that are, I learned later what it means, the high risk neighborhood, because when I saw the papers and I saw that, I said, what does that mean? And it meant that it was the people of color, inner cities, people that are not white, in those nice neighborhoods. So it's like, it's important to really prepare them if they are going to be talking and acting and working with those. It was that kind of things. And in the beginning, I couldn't understand the why, but I felt like hurt because they are pastors, they're people, they're parents, they're brothers and sisters, they're uncles, they're people dedicated to God. Why they need to be treated in that way? That was a big question that I had way back in the beginning. Now that I know more, I know the why. And I'm glad that now those things are being corrected. So yeah, there's examples there, as Rudy says, there's plenty, unfortunately.
Thanks for expanding on that, Vivi. Did you have anything that you wanted to add, Idella?
No, I think when I think of that, I think of, we support what we value, right? And that's why it's so important to have a diverse body of people to bring perspectives, bring their culture. So, so we won't just be pigeonholed into one area of thinking or one area of what we value. So I think it's, just to say, to just open up your thinking and your mindset and philosophy to bring everybody's thinking and support to everyone, not just to be one area of what we think we value. But there's a lot of things like Vivi and Rudy talked about it earlier, like the whole funding of ethnic, pastors, or we can go on and on about that. But I just think that we just need to make sure that we're bringing everybody's value to the table.
Kendra, I think one thing just being asked, what country did you immigrate from? I think just sends the message that you're not one of us. And I think that's the bigger part. And part of it is that the church was a very Dutch immigrant community. And I think that could be part of it. But then what happened, it went from that to being a white church. And then that as well is, it kind of creates a message to the receiver, you're not one of us. And eventually the message gets internalized. And then when the time comes to, for the tables that are open, it's very hard to come in and sit as being not a guest, but a fellow member, a fellow believer with other fellow believers. So that's the complexity of racism.
Yeah, thanks for expanding on those answers. And yeah, just as a person who is half Dutch, because my mom is 100% Dutch American, I should say, and growing up in West Michigan. And if you've ever heard the phrase, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, it's a joke. It's a terrible joke. It's a very bad joke, but I heard it a lot growing up. And that's because we're in West Michigan, the seat of the CRC denomination in the United States. So, and that speaks a lot about the cultural attitude. So it does shape the denomination a lot, unfortunately. And I did get another question.
Excuse me, Kendra, and I think that's one of the big problems that we are not aware that those little messages, as Rudy mentioned, they get internalized and you repeat it as you're growing up, you hear it and all the time, and they become part of you. You don't realize and you're acting that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things that seems like a harmless joke, but is actually really, really unhealthy.
Yeah.
We did get another question from an audience member that I think this is a good time to ask, since we just heard a lot from Vivi and Idella, so we'll hear a little more from you if that's okay. Someone said, as a woman, I'm very aware of the ways in which women are discriminated against and underrated in the CRC, especially at local churches. Is this same gender bias extended to women of color? And maybe you could expand on ways that maybe the gender bias differs or
Idella, you
overlap.
can- yes. Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, go ahead, either Idella or Vivi.
Yeah, I think as a woman and then as a woman of color, that intersects. So you're dealing with just the discrimination as a woman, then you're dealing with the whole discrimination as a woman of color. So I think it kind of, in a sense, for me, it doubles in a sense of what I have to walk into and what I have to deal with as a woman and then as a woman of color. So it's a, intersects. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That is so
Vivi, what
true
about you?
because you add the gender, it's true because it's already there. But if you add in top of that, you add race or racism, not race, but the racialized concept is double as Idella is saying it, because when you get into these environments, you carry those two things on top of you that you need to be aware all the time in everything that you do. And you are conscious of that all the time. And that makes it harder. You spend more energy doing things, having these two carrying on yourself.
I'm wondering
Yeah,
if
I
I could
think
follow up with Idella a second here. If you feel comfortable, you really helped me get a better understanding of being a Black woman and the box that American culture has put Black women into. Would you be able to say just a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we carry a lot. We carry a load, especially it's in our community, like Black women. We carry that load of our community, especially when we look at as a Black woman in this denomination. I think we're talking about, especially when we talk about gender issues. When we talk about gender issues, and I always think about when I hear people talk about women and gender issues, but I always think, are they thinking of me also in those issues? Are they thinking of me as a woman, but also are they thinking of me as a Black woman in those issues? Are they gonna, as a gender piece, as a gender rally, are they gonna bring me with them on some of these issues? So I always think about that, and I always like to have conversations about that when we talk about the gender piece. I'm grateful that we have a lot of powerful women in the denomination and that's doing a lot of great work. But sometimes I think, like, are you thinking of me as well and other women that look like me when we start talking about the gender issues? I mean, are you going to bring me with you, or are you going to leave me behind? So I just have these questions in my head that goes through my head, and I have this conversation with people too. But I always think about that. But I think as a Black woman, we have always been at the forefront of a lot of these, unjust issues, and we carry our community. So it doesn't change when we move out of our community into other places in the world. They say we are strong. We have to be strong, but I push back a little bit on that, because I don't believe God made me to be this strong woman. He didn't create me to be this woman to take on. No, He created me to be a beautiful, delicate woman, and He didn't create me to be this woman to carry this huge load that's impossible. He's the only one that can carry that load. So I do a little pushback on that. Like, yeah, I'm and strong in a sense internally, but I'm not strong to carry a lot of those burdens. No, I don't know if that answered your question, Mark, or not, but.
Kendra, can I comment a little bit on that? I know it wasn't addressed to me, but do we have time?
Yeah, go
for
ahead,
that?
Rudy. Yeah, we do have time. We do still need Mark's answer to the question, which I've been kept on pushing back for questions, but yeah, a short answer would be
let's
great.
go with Mark. Let's go with Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
So Mark, the question, just to rephrase, since we've taken some time for audience questions, was, can you share a little bit about your own experiences with race and power dynamics within the CRC denomination?
Sure. I swam in the water of growing up of Dutch, boy and a man of Dutch descent. in the Christian Reformed denomination. So a lot of stuff that was going on around me, I wasn't aware of the ways in which it was not only exclusive, but racist. So you mentioned a very powerful example, Kendra, that phrase, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. I think of others too. So more than once when I went to churches that I was not known, I was a visitor, I would introduce myself, and the greeting I received back was Stephenson. Now that's not a Dutch name. And that was the greeting that I received at a new congregation, as if somehow, because it's not a Dutch name, then therefore, do you really belong or not? That's kind of the question that we were asking before. And of course, as time went on, I became much more aware of bigger dynamics that, started to realize about the water that I was swimming in. So for example, it wasn't until I was long an adult that I realized how exclusive and alienating it is to play Dutch bingo for people who, for people who somehow are not part of that kind of culture. Oh, your grandmother was Hoobie. Oh yeah, I got my uncle Hoobie, blah blah blah. And and then there's people always trying to make these connections, and it's as if, okay, we are connected. We Dutch CRC people, oh yeah, we are connected with each other, but then right away that also says, they are not part of us, and that certainly goes beyond racial dynamics, but racist dynamics are really a huge part of that, and it sure is not what the gospel's about.
Thanks, Mark. I will say to just check out the comments for some book recommendations and some other chatting from the audience, but I will not particularly remark on them unless there are questions. So the next question is, what sort of power do people have in the workplace? And how is that shaped by your identity? And we'll start with Vivi, if you are ready for that, Vivi, or you can pass for now.
I can go afterwards, maybe Rudy, or yeah, if you don't mind. I need to think a little bit how to put my answer.
Okay. Rudy, are you ready?
I am ready. So I think I want to take this time to talk a little bit about the previous conversation, because it's connected to that. And basically, the question that popped into my mind as we were talking about that, what about the Black man? And where, the unfortunate thing is that this whole racism piece puts the Black man at the very lowest level. Unfortunately, this whole piece about racism, and then it's almost like these other folks are in front of, whether it be women or whether it be other people like myself, for example. But I'm thinking, I thought about it the most because in our denomination, there's still gender issues, but there's a lot more women addressing those in leadership positions than there are Black men or non-white males. And I hate to say non-white because it's really just because of this whole hierarchy of racism that kind of gets in the way. So in terms of my own power is to be able to have the courage to invite chaos, I guess, a bit, to disrupt, and to have to be confident in saying, hey, this isn't this isn't biblical how we're doing things here. And going back to scripture and to say how is the behaviors that we're expressing here, how we treat each other, is that really centered in the mission of the gospel? Or are we doing something totally different? So I don't know if that got to the question that you asked me, but that's where I was at. Thought I'd respond to it that way.
Yeah, and then a follow-up question while we're hearing from you, Rudy. How can power be used wisely for anti-racism?
Well, I would say that one thing is to believe the other person. So when somebody is telling you something, is to believe whatever they're saying is true, and not, because I think what happens is in racism is to dismiss. If there's no mutual relationship. So I'd say in sharing of power is to believe. And I would say a great example of that has been Mark's leadership, a style of servant leadership, that he was able to believe that the decisions that he could make at the tables that he was sitting would advance race relations work, even though we were not, from a place where he was at, either by position or by culture. So I think that was a very big one. And as he took, as we were able to step into speaking things that are leadership kind of things, then Mark ran with those and trusted us. And when he wasn't clear, he came back to us. And maybe when we didn't agree, we worked those things out. But I'd say primarily is just to listen and believe that there is something there, and work through it until you have some mutual leadership, mutual ways of working. May not always be uniform in terms of completely agreeing on everything, but definitely being of the same heart and mind in this work.
Thanks, Rudy. Vivi, are you ready for us to circle back to you yet?
Well, in regards to power, this is in a way it's not difficult, but it's a question that I answer. I guess the fact for me, coming from a different country where I was raised, I grew up in the church, I learned a lot. I lived under dictatorship for quite some time. And I was confirmed on who I am. And not growing in this country, I think the fact that I was assurance of who am I, what is my value as a person, I didn't get all those messages of internalization that you're inferior. And so if I'm answering the question, please let me know, otherwise I'll be quiet. But for me, it wasn't like when I was talking to someone over me, an authority or superior, I was not talking to a person that think of me as an inferior, only because I grew up in a different country. And not having that internalization of inferiority, that helped me a lot of doing what I'm doing right now. And for me, that was a power in a way, because a power that God somehow allowed me to move in this country and be in this environment, so racist environment, that knowing all my struggle, my personal life, I probably would be feeling like, oh, I can't say anything. But in that regards, I was able to mention those unfair things that I saw, but mentioning with authority in the sense of this is not right. The scripture is not allowing these things. I mean, you have hundreds of verses in the scripture that tells you, don't abuse about on the one that doesn't have. Be careful with those that are defenseless. Protect the widow, protect the children. And for you to do what you're doing, you're not applying the scripture as you do your work here with people of other races. And in that sense, I had that power and I was able to, or authority, I was able to use it in a way, but I always felt scared though, because there was always someone who can speak louder and tell you some other things. But yeah, I don't know if I'm answering the question actually, but as I said, that's, yeah, I will finish with that.
Thanks, Viviana. Idella, were you interested in answering this question?
I don't know if I can answer your question, but I think I could just talk a little bit about, my personal relationship and how power is being used, even just for me. And power could just be simply used. People say, well, how do I use power? What do I need to do with it? Well, it simply could be just used by supporting your BIPOC staff and mentoring. And when I think of that, I think of Mark, how he has been supporting me and mentoring me too, and also inviting me to decision-making tables, which that doesn't happen a lot. And so I think that's, for me, that looks like power sharing, because he's bringing me to this table and saying, I value your perspective. I value you. You have something to say. And people need to hear what you have to say, not just me, but for staff. And I think, when I think of power sharing, I think that's strategic for him to say, oh, okay, I want you to come with me to this meeting. And then the meeting is, people that make decisions. I don't make decisions, but I'm a part of that conversation. So when I think of that, I think of, how Mark is strategically using his power to support his staff and to support the work that we do.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of power is recognizing that you have any. People, to me, as I've gotten older, people who to me look dangerous are the people who aren't willing to admit to or don't recognize the power that they have. And then it can often get misused. So for me, it's been really important to know and acknowledge that I've been given the benefit of the doubt. Whereas if I had a different skin color or a last name like Gonzalez, I might not have been given the benefit of the doubt in the very same situation, even though I might have been otherwise the same person. So for me, it's been really important to acknowledge, that I do have this power. And when I became the interim director of race relations, I said to my supervisor at that time, a Black man, Colin Watson, I said, Colin, what's this? You're asking a white guy to be the head of race relations? And he's, well, no, why not? Okay, well, if you have confidence in me, I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the confidence that he entrusted in me. But then, it was a matter of building trust with staff, and we had some bumps along the way. Maybe we'll get to some of those examples yet. But even with those bumps, Rudy, Vivi, Idella, you gave me the benefit of the doubt. And, you know, I know there were things that frustrated you, but then you gave me the benefit of the doubt, and I appreciate that. And then it made opportunity for us to be able to talk things through and say, oh, you know, I didn't even realize that I stepped into a situation in which for you, it was, yeah, I mean, a pattern. Well, I'll just give one example. You know, and Vivi and I have talked about this a number of times. The very first expense report that came through was from Vivi, and there were a number of items on it. And so I just went to Vivi and I said, can you help me understand about this expense report? What I didn't know was that there was this long dynamic of white folks being much more suspicious of people of color, white supervisors being suspicious of people of color and questioning expense reports to a much greater degree, not giving the benefit of the doubt that they would give to a white colleague or to a white person that they're supervising. So I stepped into the middle of that, and then that was a big bump. And then we had to talk that through. And I'm thankful, you know, for your graciousness and forgiveness, Vivi, and that we could talk it through and work through that. But, you know, I mean, that's one example. And so I wanted to learn, and that was really important to me. And so we had more conversations about where are more of these areas where we have bumps, and then talking with other people of color who are in the CRC staff. And in fact, with a lot of help from fellow race relations staff, I put together a whole list of here it is of ways in which people of color within our staff in the CRC have experienced racism. So for me, just learning those things was really important to be able to manage the power that I have in a way that would be helpful for people, and at least as time went on, that I could be less racist in the use of that power. And I said, and I have continued to say, you know, that my desire, and of course, intent and impact can be very different, but my intent and what I expressed to Rudy, Vivi, and Idella all along has been that I want to use my positional authority as interim director of race relations, and my, you know, position, the power that I have as a white ordained non-disabled man within the Christian and Dutch descent within the Christian Reformed culture, to use that power in a way that is going to advance our work and advance the anti-racism work of, you know, within the Christian Reformed Church.
Thanks, Mark. We do have a question for the panelists. If you can speak to the power dynamics of a senior leader only inviting a person of color to the table for optics.
I'd like to speak to that. I think that's and I mean, when you enter this work, it's a little bit challenging work, and it's scary, and do you make the right things, you make the right decisions. So all those things are true and could be, but the other thing that we also have to think about is that when we're trying to when the actual work takes place, there's pushback also on how things work. So one of the tactics that is often used is to distract from the work. And while it might be true that the optics are there, one way to avoid that is to do what I think Mark was very sharp in doing, is to say, Idella is not here alone. I'm here with her. Now, some could say, well, now you've got a white person kind of saying, hey, it's because of me. But the other way to do that as well would be to not have just one person of color, but to try to balance out the scale a bit by having 2 or 3 people or 4 people, mix it up a little bit more. So that I'm thinking that's probably the way to do it. I think there's a proverb that talks about, you know, there's a lion in the street. There's always going to be something that is going to keep us, right? But this work has been around. I mean, this racism has been around for 400 years. So I think we're going to have to take every single opportunity we can and work it to move the needle on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudy. Did any of the panelists want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, I think the situation that the comment that I added about Mark and I at the decision-making tables, I think for me, it didn't feel like I was sort of token or whatever, because Mark invited me to the table, but also how I shared, my perspective, my voice was heard. I felt my voice was heard, right? The impact was different. So for me, it didn't feel like I was just, being token to be at the table, or it was very sincere. I know Mark's heart. We all have a relationship, so we're very vulnerable and trustworthy with one another. So it didn't feel like it was just him. It was, bringing me to the table as its optics. It was more of he valued my voice and my opinion. So that made it, feel like, that you see me and you hear me.
Yeah, I think one thing that I do appreciate a lot from Mark, I knew him before he was assigned as a supervisor, is his heart. His heart is really looking for how to do what God wants me to do. And you can see that he really looks for that. And that makes a whole change. He's eager to learn. He always asks questions. And I think he's able to be vulnerable and willing to learn. And that is incredibly helpful, because open the space to have conversation, to have open conversation, honest conversation, when you actually can tell him, you know what, this, and then that. But if Mark wouldn't have that attitude, it probably will be a big wall between of us. And I think I've told him, you have the right heart. And I really think so, because impressed me the fact how hard he really wants to serve the Lord. And that really makes a difference.
Yeah, I think too, that Mark, the vulnerability that he showed being our supervisor, and his posture of humility, and being vulnerable to say, you know what, I got this wrong. I got this wrong, and forgive me, but how do I teach me? So the posture was different. The tables were turned a little bit. So we were actually, we did the teaching and learning together. So I think that was huge, that his posture was just different in approaching, us as staff.
Thanks for those responses, everyone. We have one
Sorry,
more.
Can I just add one more thought? I think
definitely.
the question was about optics and tokenism, and why that, I think that's so important to keep that in mind. We've been talking about context. So any one action may seem like, oh, that's not racist. But when it's in a bigger context, it is a racist action. So somebody gets asked, and I remember one conversation, I think the four of us, Rudy, Vivi, Idella, and I, were all in on a conversation with a fellow staff member who's a person of color. And that person said, I am never going to serve on a hiring team again, because I've been asked, and I thought, oh, so they want my perspective. And then said, but it was clear that I wasn't there because anybody was interested in my perspective. They were just interested in having me being on this team because I'm a person of color. And so for me anyway, that just really hit home that if we're going to value each other's opinions, we need to make sure that that's clear. Just simple stuff like not interrupting each other, making sure that the opinion is valued, that as soon as somebody says something that, that there may be ways to highlight it. And especially, it's not like anybody needs me as a white savior. But I, once again, recognizing my power as a white non-disabled man, if somebody says something if I repeat it and make sure to attribute it to the other, the person of color, that reminds everybody that that person's opinion is important and needs to be valued by the whole group.
Yeah, thanks for those answers, everyone.
Can I say one short little thing here?
Yeah.
I think where we're the most guilty of optics, of bad optics, or using optics as a way to say we're doing a good job, is in hiring processes. We have, in the past, I think we had a lot more people of color apply for jobs that were part of the CRC and stopped applying for jobs because they were able to get through the first parts, but then when it came down to the hiring part, they were never considered. And several of my friends have had this experience. So I'd say as a CRC, that's one area that we have had, we've been complicit in supporting in racism. And, you know, that's something that somebody could look at, but I would say from talking to friends that I know and I'm aware of, that has happened.
Thanks, Rudy. And before we move on to our next portion of the discussion, we had one more audience question requesting suggestions for teams that are pretty homogenous culture-wise. So kind of a question about how they can make sure that everyone is included. And I'll leave that kind of popcorn style up to the panelists too to answer as they think of answers, because that's a question from the audience that we hadn't planned on. And I've been mulling over one example that I wanted to give that is not related to race, but is related to gender, which can overlap a lot while the panelists think of their answers. So when I started the CRC, one of the first meetings I was in, I had something to say. I drew in my breath to talk, and then two men started talking at the same time. But for the first time in my life, I kid you not, this has never happened to me before, they immediately noticed and shut their mouths and looked at me and were like, "You go first." That's a huge gesture, and that meant a ton to me. I was very used to men in a workplace setting talking right over me. I'm sure a lot of women know what I'm talking about. But that gesture of watching body language, people will make it pretty clear when they're getting ready to talk. So that's something that you can steward as well, is just noticing who in the room has something to say.
Well, I think that question is maybe begs a deeper question, like why are we the way we are? And there's some good reasons for that, right? There might be where you work, where you live. But I think that would be a good start to begin there. And then the next level would be, who are we working with? And then how do we listen? How do we believe? And how do we follow up on things that we're hearing that don't make any sense to us? That's not the way we work. So that would be my suggestion. Try to work that out as much as possible. And then if your staff is getting older and their retirement is close, like it is for me, then consider filling those positions with somebody who's not part of your culture. And as you do that, you might get the pushback, hey, are we back to affirmative action? Or but you're really trying to get closer to what you're working on.
Yeah, any other suggestions from panelists before we move on?
want to affirm what Rudy said about asking the bigger back question. Why did this happen that this team is so homogeneous? So for example, you might have a position in which it's advertised, a position opening, only people who are ordained ministers of the word in the Christian Reformed Church are eligible to apply. As soon as you put that restriction on the position, it really limits who is going to be able to apply. And suddenly, most of the potential applicants are white men, and I would guess white men of Dutch descent. So that, so then that raises the question, do we really need to have somebody who's an ordained minister of the word in the Christian Reformed Church in this position? And that's just one example.
What is interesting also about that is that somebody can say, well, the people of color should have been gone to the seminary and have the same titles and everything. But there's some other layers that are playing a role there. Why is it that not a whole lot of people of color are going through the seminary like that? That's another thing that brings other stuff. So you find different layers that are playing a role in it. Because even there's how many people there are immigrants and are pastor ordained in their countries with experience and everything, but it's like it's not valid in here. That's just one huge thing. Yeah.
Sure, let's ask how many people of color have started at Calvin Seminary and didn't finish because it was too difficult. They found the atmosphere too oppressive. And
Right.
I can think of several that I was in seminary with back in the 80s. And, and that's just over the course of a brief period of time that I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everyone. Anything else to add before we move on? Rudy, I think you unmuted.
Yes, I think Mark brought up something good. I think the assumptions that we make when there's a person of color, the assumption is always, do they have the technical capacity to apply for this job? But when a white person applies, the question is never asked, do they have the cultural competence to work in this position? So I think those assumptions are something that we should at least bring into the conversation. The other one would be that the CRC is very Eurocentric. So there's a high value on rigor, academic rigor, for knowing, but less rigor on the practice of what you know, of living out the gospel, of having good relationships, of being kind and compassionate. So there's some, I don't know who came up with it, but one person said it's hearts on fire, minds on fire, hearts of coal. And as we are trying to live into the gospel, I think we're going to have to create a third space for both. And that's why a lot of folks like myself are here, because we appreciate how things are organized and structured in terms of scripture, doctrine, theology. But what's not so good is how it's, I guess it would be the polity, maybe, how things are carried out. There's a lot of culture woven into that pushes out other cultures.
And then I'll leave this kind of popcorn style up to the panelists as well. But a follow-up question to that is, how can supervisors use their power for advocacy well?
Want me to start? Rudy had asked that question in a kind of preparatory meeting that we had for this, so I jotted a few notes. So it really hit home for me. I've taken the intercultural developmental inventory a couple of times. That what that's really about is, am I willing to move toward the other and adjust my ways of interacting in a way that's going to be so that we can find mutual ground. And I mean, one example that in the prep for taking that inventory that just really hit home for me about this supervisor sitting in a meeting, and the supervisor was a white man, and then there was an Asian man in the meeting, and the supervisor was very upset because the Asian man, disrespected me because he won't look me in the eye. And then somebody confronted the white man, outside of the meeting and said, well, don't you think that may have something to do with culture? No, it has nothing to do with culture. It's about respect. He doesn't respect me. So, I mean, for me anyway, just starting to think about what do I need to do? Because for people of color, you're always having to find ways to interact with the white society. So for me as a white, ordained, non-disabled male, what things do I need to do to move toward the other so that we can find common ground and a common place for connecting with each other, instead of my expecting the people of color always simply to, adjust to me. That means there's going to be some discomfort that's going to come along the way. And in some cases, significant discomfort. I certainly found that to be true at first, especially, but along the way too. But then, I kept reminding myself, and it wasn't just me, it was thank Vivi, Rudy, Idella reminding me, well, if you're feeling uncomfortable, what do you think it's like to be a person of color in this society? You're just getting a taste of what, many of us have to live with every single day. Oh, okay. And of course, that's one of the big challenges in terms of making adjustments, is that a lot of us white folks just are not used to feeling uncomfortable around issues of race. And then when that discomfort comes, being unwilling to live with this discomfort, it really hit home for me. Sitting in a webinar by Denise Kingdom Greer one time, and she talked not only about discomfort, but she talked about escalation. To assume that the discomfort and tension is going to continue to escalate, but to stay with it, to stay with the discomfort. And for me anyway, that's part of what it means to be a servant leader, is to stay with that discomfort. And recognizing that we're all together, that I don't have to make all the decisions. And in fact, I don't want to make all the decisions. And if I were making all the decisions, they would not be good ones. That's where the power sharing has to come into play, of interacting, listening, and listening humbly, and recognizing that, I mean, it's about being Christ-like. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So it means that I'm finding ways to set aside my own need for comfort or whatever else in order to be able to function together as a team well.
That's also an expression of white privilege, that a white person doesn't have to, or they believe they don't have to go to live in two worlds, like a person of color that is always going back and forth, back and forth. A white person assume that everybody else, that you're saying, has to accommodate to my needs, not the opposite. And that's a huge thing that, yeah, a white person don't want to do. I mean, who wants to live your privilege? I mean, why you say I need to make this sacrifice if you want? But yeah, you're right.
I saw somebody asked for an example of staying with the discomfort. Sure. A lot of meetings that I participate in, there's a clear agenda, and you move through the agenda. You make sure that you're done with the agenda by the time set when the meeting is supposed to be done. And we have a meeting every Wednesday at noon. And I had to adjust to, and it was uncomfortable for me at first. I don't know if I've ever talked about this, but we just kind of roll with, well, what do we need to talk about today? And things kind of come up, and then we talk about something for quite a long time. And I think, wow, I didn't think that we would need to talk about it for that long, but clearly that was important. And once again, going back to the intercultural development inventory, I even have language for that now. They talk about monochronic versus polychronic meetings. And the monochronic is boom, boom, boom. We're gonna, here's this linear path from agenda item 1 to agenda item 6, boom, we're done on time. To polychronic, where you're doing a number of things at the same time in terms of building relationships, making decisions, discussing and thinking things through. And that was uncomfortable for me. And it was important for me just to set it, to live with my discomfort and say, this is the way these meetings run, and I need to adjust myself to that. And that's a way that I can learn and grow. I really haven't experienced a fairly regular polychronic sort of meetings like that in the past. And so that was a good thing for me.
Thanks, Mark. We do have a question from the audience. How does an organization that has kind of historically not hired very diverse people, or a diverse range of people, how can they broaden their recruitment efforts if they just keep hiring the same kind of people over and over again?
Well, I can at least tell you of what I've seen has happened. And that is that HR started going to different places to recruit, different schools. Normally we were hitting up the CRC schools, and then they started going to different places as well, especially if there's going to be people of color. So they went to those as well. So I think our denomination has really improved that part. What I think we're working on now is how do you actually hire people of color? So what has to change in our mindsets to see the value of hiring people of color? If you go to a company, it's easier because there's profitability. Does it make good business sense? And it does. And it does not make good business sense to stay monocultural. So I think that's where we need to believe that it is more missional to have diversity. It is more gospel centered if we have more diversity. So I think that's where I would say.
I'll give other panelists a second to think about a possible response, and I think a question that's similar enough to be along the same vein is, more importantly, how can the CRCNA change the culture to retain people of color?
Yeah, I think for me, just
Go ahead, Idella.
valuing and pouring into the person and hoping, pouring into it in the sense that they be successful. Yeah, I think for me, that's what keeps me here, because there's people in the denomination that's supporting me and mentoring me. There's something to be said to people of color that's coming into the denomination. I think they need their own kind of a sort of a version of understanding, what this is. I mean, we have our own HR packet when we come in to know what to do and how to do it and so forth. But I think as people of color, I think you do need another sort of another conversation of, of structure, right? Of how to maneuver through the systems and structures. But I think for me, just, supporting people of color in, just making sure they have the mentor. I think the mentor is very important, having a mentor as a person of color in the denomination. I think that's important.
The other
I'd like to add
important
to that.
thing-
Go ahead, Vivi, sorry.
Yeah, the other important thing that I truly believe it should be part of is that the human resources or the leadership, those who made the decisions, is to have a system where, let's say a person of color complain about something that happened, but nothing is done about it. And it comes again and nothing is done about it. And then again, and nothing is done about it. What are you saying with those behaviors? What are you saying with that attitude? I mean, it should be some type of discipline or something needs to be in place, because for how long you're going to have a person of color receiving, and nothing happened to the other who's doing the damage and of discipline. I mean, the church has discipline system, right? And if the denomination is part of the church, it should have those things, not with the intention of punishing someone, but to teach. But it should be something in place, because otherwise a person of color can take so much. It's a person. You can't expect the person to continuously be boom, 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 and do nothing. So yeah, I think that that's something that it should be in there.
I'd like to just say that there are some things that are being done that I think are good. I think the hard part is that it's going to dismantle, it's going to disrupt. So there's going to be pushback on those things. And I think one example is the code of conduct. I think Colin and the leadership in the COD, and they've really, I guess I would just say thank you for that. It's the whole thing of being servant leaders in the code of conduct. That Philippians, I think it was 2:6-8. I forget the passage that they referenced. So I would say that's one thing that is at least an aim, and we're good at aspirational kind of statements, but that's one aim that is good, that we say we want to address this. The second one is World Renew has some ideas about mentoring, onboarding, and I'm not sure where they're at, but I think following through on those types of things are really healthy and helpful. You need somebody to sponsor, if you will, you into a new organization, aside from racism. But if you're gonna have a person of color coming into a predominantly white institution, then us sponsoring I think would be really helpful. Not necessarily to assimilate, but to make a person aware of what the maybe the where you might fall into some landmines. So at least that part. So those are things that I think the denomination is already doing and have had on the books for a little bit. It's just following through and making sure that the accountability piece has to be in place. And I think that's what you were talking about too, Vivi. In fact, World Renew had even talked about having like an ombudsman-like person, even if it was contracted. I don't know if they follow through on that either, but I think when somebody does have a complaint, it makes it difficult because then you have to go back to your supervisor, work with him and or her, and it's complicated that way. But so those are my experience that I've seen so far.
I've talked to a number of people of color who had been on staff here and said, I left because I couldn't take it anymore. And, and that hurts so much. So I think about, okay, so when I became the interim director of race relations, and I probably should have decided long ago that I should have gotten educated, what are the microaggressions and not so microaggressions that we white colleagues do? And that's where, that article came, and I circulated it internally for a while first, and then finally we working together with the four of us, made it a public post. So just to simply be aware of this broader context in which we're operating, and that things that, as among white folks, oh, no big deal, Dutch bingo, for example. But all of a sudden you realize, oh, that can be really exclusive to anybody who's not part of that, that whole sort of fabric and culture of the CRC. I had thought of one other idea, but it's gone. In terms of retention, no, maybe I'll think of it, maybe not. But anyway, for us, but just to emphasize again, for us white staff to decide, we need to take responsibility to make sure that we are working at becoming, working at a culture that in which everybody can know that they belong and can participate and use their gifts, and that their gifts, ideas are valued. And of course, that's not just true in terms of racism, it's true in terms of sexism, which we talked about quite a bit. We haven't talked yet about ableism, but we could talk about that as well in terms of people with various disabilities, and that everybody can take their gifts and to be able to use them well. But that is a huge culture shift, and it means examining what are our practices, what are our policies. Oh, that was the other thing I was going to mention. So on the books, I think there has been a policy that if any job description shifts significantly, that then the job needs to be posted. And whoever holds the job might lose their job to somebody else. And I challenged that because I said, look, what if we have people who are growing in their job, who are people of color, but let's say don't have a college degree, and the job description has shifted because of expectations and so on, and this person is serving in that job well, shouldn't we just simply give them a new job description? Because if we post the position and say a college degree is required, automatically then somebody loses their job. And what a terrible thing that would be if somebody's grown into a job because they've grown over the years, and then we post the position and then they're eliminated. I assume one of the reasons why that policy was created in the first place was so that it wasn't simply entrenched that we were always white folks promoting white folks. But any policy needs to be looked at in terms of what will its effects be on things like employee retention, and especially retention of employees who are people of color. And I think there needs to be flexibility.
So we have about 6 minutes left. So I want to make sure that we get one more question squeezed in, and that's our last question on vulnerability. So there's lots of directions we could go with this. We just talked a lot about how advocacy is in part the act of stewarding power effectively. You could define advocacy as many other things, but that's one of the big things that we touched on. So a question for the panelists is, how does vulnerability fit into advocacy and anti-racism work?
Well, I could just talk a little bit about, as far as the dynamics with our team. I think when we talk about vulnerability, we will have to, I think we should start with truth telling and being transparent about our own biases, our prejudices. And I think that's something that we all did as a team, to really lay down what it is, what our biases and our prejudices, we all have them, right? So I think for me, being vulnerable and understanding that we set a table of a safe place to be able to be vulnerable. And I think we all did that together. And I do feel that we did that in a way that we knew we had to do that before we even go any further. We had to be vulnerable with each other. We had to, be truth tellers with one another and to say, hey, these are some things that I'm dealing with, or these are some of the biases and prejudices that I bring to the team, and how do we, move past that? So I think for me, in order for us to even be this team or that we've created, and not to say that we are all perfect now, right? We went through all of this with the year. We're not. We're still dealing with a lot of things within each other, within our team dynamics. But I think for us, it's just we wanted to just share those aches with others to say, hey, this is the things that we went through. This is how we were vulnerable. This is how we were just truth telling to one another. And I think that's so important for us to be able to move from where we were a year ago and where we are today. We trust each other more. We love each other. We are like a small little community that we all have each other back. And I just wanted to reiterate one thing about supervisors and Mark in his position. Mark was willing to take some criticism. There was a lot of criticism came within that last year in 2020. There was a lot of criticism. There was a lot of heat sort of in race relations. And Mark was willing to, we talked about him like, if you're going to advocate, you're going to be our supervisor, these are things that's going to happen. And so he was willing to say, hey, you know what, I'm willing to take those criticism and sort of be a buffer for us as people of color. He was sort of a buffer for us. And I just really appreciate that. But yeah, it wasn't easy, because that's not something I'm just going to say that Mark, criticism it doesn't happen a lot. I'm assuming, Mark, I'm going to assume for you, right? But it did happen, in race relations, that he was able to, take that criticism for us. There's times that we were just wore out and just wore down. And Mark was like, you know what, I got this one. I'm going to, take this one for the team. So I just wanted to share that. I'm not sure if it answered any of your questions, but just wanted to kind of share that.
I think we're all afraid to be vulnerable because we're all protect ourselves. I mean, that's a natural reaction as a human being. We're going to protect it, especially if in the past, in your experience, you've been having a difficult life, etc. But without that ingredient, it's like when you're cooking something or making something delicious for the family, if you miss one ingredient that is very important, the cake, the whatever, it's not going to look the same. And this ingredient, being vulnerable, is a decision that you have to make. It doesn't come like that. You decide to make yourself vulnerable in order to grow, in order to learn, in order to work better together, in order really to look for the end to work. So, but it's a growing process. It's not a, voila, I'm vulnerable now. No, it's a process that as you are growing in Christ and growing as you work, you are growing. I can say I'm witness of my own life. Before I was like totally shut. I'm not saying anything. Now I think my team pretty much know me and they can see my face, or yeah. So I think that's a good thing to do. I mean, it's a blessing, to be honest, to be vulnerable.
I really appreciated it, Vivi. There was one time in a team meeting that there was something that was triggering to you and you just said, I have to go. And you were very open about that. And, to me, a huge part of this conversation, although these words have not been used much, are trust and love. And to me, that's really where the vulnerability comes into place, is that we can be vulnerable because we trust each other and because we love each other and we work together in this loving relationship. And love doesn't mean that we always are agreeing and happy and always smiling, but it means that we are sticking with each other.
Thanks, everyone. So it is 1:30. We can have a quick wrap up if people want to stay on a little longer, but I will say if you are dropping off the webinar, thanks for coming. There's a lot of great resources that got dropped in the chat by our tech support, and also a great way to keep up with the Office of Race Relations is their Facebook page. It's updated all the time. There's also lots of resources on the Office of Race Relations website itself too. Anything the panelists would like to add as a quick wrap-up thought?
Thank you. Thanks to
Thank
everybody.
you for
who
being
joined.
there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
and-
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
all.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.